Thank you, Priya, for that very nice welcome, and thank you, everybody. It's my absolute pleasure and delight to be here this morning. This is the first time I'm here in Oxford for an OxFID event, and I was also privileged to listen to Phil sitting there. I think Phil's talk, which is brilliant as it was, and very, very comprehensive, has made my task very, very easy, because I know that you all are very well informed of all the 16 SDGs and 169 targets, is that right? So brilliant. So that really sets the context for the discussions today. Sadly, I don't have PowerPoint presentations, so you might have to listen very carefully to what I say, and I hope I don't put you to sleep. But before I start, 3 warm-up questions. How many of you in this room think that the MDGs were a success? Hands up, please. Okay, with some reluctance, there's a hand for, okay, thank you very much. How many of you think that the MDGs were not a success? Okay, so fairly strong opinion. How many of you were around doing something to do with international development in the year 2000? So guys, we are to be blamed for that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about, the theme of my talk is SDGs 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I was thinking of what was my life in the year 2000. Obviously, there was a lot of excitement, turn of the century, turn of the millennium, new hope, new sunshine, new world, new everything. And to be very honest, I don't really remember MDGs. Phil, do you remember the MDGs in the year 2000? No. And I was really trying hard when I was coming here for this talk. When do I think I heard about the MDGs for the first time? And probably it was the year 2002. And I should be very honest about it, I don't remember having heard of. And even in 2002, there were different words used. I suppose some of you in the room might remember the term international development targets. That was one of the terms that was used. And it was quite some time before MDGs got traction. And I think in many countries, if I'm not mistaken, MDGs got traction around 2005, and before you realize it was 2010, and we were trying to review, and we were trying to see that there were only 5 years left, and then there was panic. There was panic because suddenly governments realized that we had signed up to something, and we are waking up to this very late, and we have to thank China for having helped us achieve the income poverty targets. And China didn't bother, but they didn't care about MDGs. But nevertheless, we were very happy that there was a country called China which helped us achieve the income poverty target. So that's what was the MDG scene, which I think some of you who were around at that time might agree with me. The other thing I was told was that MDGs, and I think Phil really touched upon it in some detail, but one of the things I heard at that time was that MDGs were drawn up by a group of 4 wise men in New York. I don't know whether that was true, particularly the wisdom part, but the men part is probably quite true. Things have changed since then, and Phil did talk about it. So there's a lot of good stuff that has happened around the MDGs. The MDGs only applied to poor countries. And at the global level, they were written in such a way that the most important goal around income poverty was going to be met anyway, because China had already started making significant progress. And there were other big developing countries or emerging economies, and they were growing at such rapid levels that some of those targets could actually be achieved. And those targets were not really ambitious. If you actually remember some of those targets, it was all about halving proportion of people without this, or halving proportion of people without that. So it is very easy for governments to go to those lower hanging fruits, get to those bottom, the more easily accessible first half, and not really think of what's going to happen to those who are farther away, more inaccessible, and the more difficult to reach people. By contrast, many of the SDGs are very ambitious, and you did have a look at it. Achieving gender equality, full and productive employment and decent work, and reducing inequality within and among countries are definitely very, very ambitious. And if you think about it, it was, I think, in February that the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon famously said, "Ours is the first generation with the potential to end poverty, and the last to act to avoid the worst effects of climate change. So that was kind of setting the context of pushing us all to think and be very ambitious, be a bit more bold and courageous. In the UK as well, the Prime Minister has been talking about leaving no one behind, particularly in the run-up to the SDGs. So there have been some very bold statements that were made before the SDGs were finalized. One other important difference with the SDGs is that they apply to all countries, including in the UK. And this means that communities and civil society organizations in each member state could possibly have new tools, though they are not legally binding tools, to advocate for their agenda and holding governments to account, as Phil also mentioned. And for those struggling for just and sustainable solutions, this can be a very, very powerful mechanism to hold the respective governments to account, not just at the national level, but also at the global level, because this is now a global responsibility. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about ActionAid's own understanding of the SDGs and where we see some of the opportunities, but at the same time, some of the concerns we have around the SDGs. So let me focus on a few. Let me first talk about Goal 5, which is on gender equality, because in ActionAid we believe that that's absolutely core to the achievement of several of the other goals, and it has got huge potential to improve lives of women and girls. Let's take a quick look at some of the facts. 30% of the women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual violence. 150 million girls are sexually assaulted on their way to school or at school each year. The UN estimates that in 2012 alone, nearly 44,000 women were killed by a family member or a partner. An academic study of 70 countries found that the presence of a strong and independent women's rights organization was the single biggest factor contributing to the reduction of violence against women, and this was much more important than the GDP or the number of women in political roles. Women remain discriminated against socially, politically, and economically, which means that they are disproportionately subject to poverty and marginalization. For instance, 70% of the world's 1.3 billion people who are poor are women. So that's the context in which the SDG 5 has been framed. The challenge is definitely huge, but the new goal gives us hope that we can get the political will and the sustained effort necessary to make progress. At ActionAid, we are particularly excited about the target on eradicating violence against women. And the target reads, eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation. The previous MDG on gender equality was not achieved, as many of us know. And this one is going to be even more ambitious. And so there are big questions on whether it's possible for this goal to be achieved. And for that, governments across the world need to wake up. We already have some interesting signs of progress, though they're slow, but there is some progress. It's almost 6 months now since the SDGs were announced, and that's already causing concern about how serious we are going to be taking, but there's some signs of progress. And to give a very quick example, there is now a high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, which has a number of influential people on the board, including the President of the World Bank, the President of IMF, and the UK's International Development Secretary of State, Justine Greening. So there are some steps that are being taken, and there's hope that something could happen. At ActionAid, we think that we need to make progress at 3 levels. The first one is on leadership, implementation, and accountability, so that all governments should implement national action plans on violence against women and girls. We know from the MDG experience that unless you have that national level buy-in, and unless those plans are comprehensive and well-resourced, you're not going to achieve the goals that you set out to achieve. The second one is about women's voice and participation. Governments should prioritize and support women's organizations as partners in the fight against violence. Phil referred to women and girls being agents of change, being agents of transformational change. We've also seen statistics about women's rights organizations who are so poorly resourced that they don't really have the capacity to address some of these very complex issues in the respective contexts. And the third one is around financing. There needs to be specific funding for strong, independent women's rights organizations, and therefore we are calling on the government of UK to lead the way by announcing a fund as they rethink their support to civil society for development. We think that these are absolutely critical in addressing the disproportionate burden that women and girls face in accessing the various services, in accessing opportunities for sustainable livelihood, and very importantly, realize their rights as equal and or normal citizens of the country and the context in which they live in. Now, while this might seem very complex, there is a lot of optimism that comes from some of the work at the grassroots level. And let me give you an example from an ActionAid program in Nigeria. According to UNESCO and UNICEF, Nigeria has more children out of school than any other country in the world. And working with our local partners, ActionAid Nigeria has established a network of girls' clubs. And since 2010, these girls' clubs operate in 120 schools in 15 states, including in Chibok, where we heard about the devastating abduction of 223 girls by Boko Haram last year. The clubs have helped produce a generation of confident girls who are determined to change their destiny, change their course of their lives, and creating forums and spaces where they talk about their own lives, they talk about health, they talk about education, and very importantly, encourage children and their parents to make sure that the children go to school, and girls in particular, they continue with their education. This is a kind of momentum at the grassroots level that needs to be identified, that needs to be supported, and that needs to be scaled up. And that requires a very strong partnership between civil society and national governments.